Video builds on the earlier video where we considered how to summarize values collected on a categorical variable and how to represent it graphically. Well, sometimes if we have a row of data points and our interest is to condense all of those insights into a single data label. For a categorical variable, we are usually interested in the most frequently occurring category. This is called the mode. Let's take an example here. Data from the International Tanker Owners Pollution Federation Limited give the cause of spillage for 460 large oil tankers accidents from 1970 to 2016. And here is a display. Well, if we are told to write a brief report interpreting what the bar plot shows, what we should indicate is what is the modal cause of spillage, and that will be grounding. This will be the mode for this categorical variable. And so a brief report here could indicate that the modal cause of spillage, or the most frequently occurring cause of spillage for large oil tanker accidents in the year specified, is grounding, followed by collisions. This would be a brief way to communicate the insight contained in the data. Here is another example. In this example, I'd like to highlight how sometimes statistics can be misused. Here is the case of a dean who is focused on one particular question on the course evaluation. And that question was, considering all factors of importance to you, how would you rate this instructor? Write 1 if it is excellent, 2 if you have good, 3 if it's average, and so on, until 5, which is very poor. After collecting data from all the students who rated this instructor, the dean had the staff compute the means for each class and for each professor. He then listed the classes and faculty in order based on the mean or average values. And he based the major part of the performance evaluation on where a faculty member stood with respect to the mean score on this question. By the way, he carried the calculations to 3 decimal places. How is this a wrong way to carry out analysis data collected from each class on each professor? You see, collecting data on 1 to 5, which of course indicates that this is an ordinal form of data, indicates that we're using numbers to represent labels. So if numbers represent labels, you see, if the labels they represent themselves, which is excellent, good, average, and so on, if they cannot be added with a meaningful result, then the numbers that represent them should also not be added to get means or averages. That would be an incorrect way to carry about our analysis. That leaves the question, what should we do otherwise? We should compute the median for ordinal values of a categorical variable. That would have been a correct way to summarize this. Well, talking about median, we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. Stay tuned. Then that leaves us with a perfect segue into discussing how to summarize two categorical variables when our goal is to analyze them together. How should we go about it? You see, when you have two categorical variables and our goal is to summarize data on two categorical variables, we summarize the counts in a two-way table called a contingency table. A contingency table is also otherwise called a joint frequency distribution table. Okay? Now, to illustrate what a contingency table looks like, it is simply a two-dimensional table, one row-wise and column-wise. So you have the row variable. In this case, that'll be investor type, and we also have the column variable, Let me grab that. And then we have the column variable, which is knowledge level response. In this context, what is that about? Let's read up on this. In a survey conducted by a brokerage company, investors were asked to rate how knowledgeable they felt they were as investors. Both online and traditional investors were included in the survey. The survey resulted in the following data. Out of all those who are online investors, 8%, 55%, and 37% responded that they were savvy, experienced, and novice, respectively. On the other hand, out of all those who are traditional investors, the percentages were 4%, 29%, and 67% respectively. Out of the total 600 investors who were surveyed, let's write that down, 600, 200 were traditional investors, which means the total number of traditional investors was 200, leaving a total of 400 to be online investors. We're to use this information provided to summarize the information in a joint frequency distribution table or a contingency table. So we have been told that online, 8% of the 400 responded that they were savvy. So what is 8% of 400? 8% of 400 will be 32. What about 55% of 400? 55% of 400 is 220. And lastly, we have 37% of 400, that would be 148. Then on the other hand, for traditional investors, you have 4%, 29%, and 67% of 200. So what is 4% of 200? That would be 8. And the next is 29% of 200, that is 58. And lastly, 67% of 200, that is 134. Let me go ahead and erase some of this. Okay. And at the end of the day, we have summarized this information using a joint frequency distribution table or a contingency table. We're to next use this information to construct a joint relative frequency distribution table. To do that, the word relative indicates that we're going to look at each count in each cell relative to the total count. So that means the number here will be 32 out of what? 600. We're interested in the weight. That will be about 0.0533. Next is 220 out of 600. That is 0.3667. The next is 148 out of 600. That is 0.2467 approximately. And next you have 8 out of 600. That is 0.0133. Then next we have 58 out of 600, 0.0967. And finally we have the last number here, which is 134 out of 600. That will give us 0.2233. The usefulness of the relative frequency distribution is that it can readily provide knowledge on the percentage of experimental units or observation units that have certain desired characteristics. All right. For question C here, we are to determine the proportion of investors who are both online investors and who rated themselves what? Experienced. So for online investors, who also rated themselves experienced, so experienced, we're looking at the intersection of both characteristics. That would be 0.3667. Yep, excuse me. All right. Yes, very correct. But in particular, we might notice that we don't have that particular value here, excuse me. So for online investors who also rated themselves, yes, that would be 0.3667, correct. Good. Next, let us see more on how to picture or graph two categorical variables. Usually we use bar plots or bar charts, and there are two types. We can use segmented or side-by-side bar plots. To illustrate what that means, let's consider an example. The data collected here has to do with the Titanic. There were those who survived on the Titanic alive and those who died at the end of that ordeal. Then there were the different categories of ticket classes. You have the first class, the second class, the third class, and the crew members. Now, our interest is to answer a research question. We have that 201 individuals on the Titanic survived alive and they held a first class ticket. Now, looking at these numbers, what insights can we extract from it? Can we use a picture to illustrate what's going on? The answer is yes. So, what we have decided to do is we have created a side by side bar plot here, and here we have a segmented or stacked what? Bar plot in this case. And the goal here is to see if the insights in this picture, if they indicate or say anything to answer the question if there is an association between the ticket class held by the person and whether they survived alive or dead. You see, if you look closely, for those who are alive at the end of the ordeal, it seems to decrease over as we proceed from first to second to third to crew. So there is a difference. So also is the difference we see as we move across the different class of tickets from crew to third class to second class and to first class. You see, this difference indicates that the ticket class makes a difference in whether a person will survive or die. So this picture indicates some level of dependence between the ticket class that the person is holding and whether the person survives alive or dead. That is what this side by side bar plot illustrating the relationship between ticket class and survival says. The same can be said about the difference we observe here from going from those alive to dead for the different ticket class holders. So both pictures indicate that that one variable makes a difference in the other variable, or there is a dependence of survival on the Titanic and the passenger's ticket class. These are not the only ways we can represent the relationship between two categorical variables. On the next page, we have mosaic plots. And in the case of mosaic plots, I have an example here where I've collected data on one variable, application type, could be individual application or joint application. And then on the other hand, we have another categorical variable where you have rent, mortgage, own. So for these two categorical variables, application type and home ownership, the research question is, do we perceive that there might be any relationship between these two variables? We can represent this relationship using a mosaic plot. Here is a mosaic plot. So the 10,000 in total corresponds to the total size of this rectangle or square. So and this has been broken down into rent, into mortgage, and then into those who own. With that said, we would like to now break down rent even further into the two subgroups of rent, namely those who have the individual application type and those who have what? The joint application type. That we are doing here. So individual versus joint. And the same goes for mortgage and own. So in this case, we can see some differences in the level of individual across the groups. So the question though is if this difference is significant enough to say that there is a relationship between application type and home ownership response type. That will be reserved for inferential statistics. But at first look, this might suggest that the application type makes what? A difference in the home ownership type.